Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Arroyo Live. From the Pasadena Media Center, I'm Joe Carbonetta. This program is produced by Pasadena Media to help enrich the community through informative and meaningful conversation. Remember, you can share your questions or comments with us anytime at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org. Tonight, on a special edition of Arroyo Live, we talk with California State Assemblyman Chris Holden, who also happens to be a former mayor of Pasadena. Please join me for Arroyo Live. Joining me now is Assemblyman Chris Holden. Welcome. Chris, if it's all right with you, I'd like to ask you to start out by telling our viewers at home a little bit more about yourself.
I'm an assembly member who represents the 41st Assembly District. My district is fairly a large district, as all these assembly districts are, roughly around 485,000 in population. I have Pasadena and Altadena, South Pasadena, Sierra Madre, East Pasadena, and Monrovia as the western part of the district. The eastern part, San Dimas, Laverne, Claremont, portions of Rancho Cucamonga, which is the San Antonio Heights, Mount Baldy, where there's a fire that was started yesterday, and then I also represent all of Upland. I served on the Pasadena City Council for nearly 24 years, was mayor, and grew up in Pasadena, attended Pasadena High School, played basketball there. We were state champs 2 years in a row. Went to San Diego State and graduated there, came home and started my political community service career.
Your political career actually includes an area that's a little more local as well. You spent some time as the mayor of Pasadena. Is that not correct?
That's correct. I was I guess when the history will show, I'm the last rotated mayor. We moved to elected mayor in '99, I believe it was, and that was the last year that I served as mayor on the council. Bill Bogard preceded me as mayor, or actually followed me as mayor. He actually preceded me as well, but so it was a great opportunity to serve with some wonderful, committed public servants. But I enjoyed my time as mayor. We were able to essentially move an initiative that created the position for elected mayor. And so I think I'd like to believe, with the kind of folks who've been serving in that role and continue to serve in that role, that the citywide vision and leadership goals are being and objectives are being realized. I think it's necessary. A city like Pasadena has a lot of dynamic issues and requires that kind of leadership. And I think we've gotten great leadership out of the folks who've served in that role.
We thank you for your service both locally and on the larger scale where you are now. Your political service has spanned obviously a number of years, and this is a tricky time for everyone, not just in politics, but obviously with the global pandemic. A lot of the dynamic in society has changed. Recently, we have, or at least thought we were seeing, a light at the end of the tunnel. The most recent statistics seem to suggest that maybe that light is a little further off than we thought. But coming out of the almost 16-month lockdown, what has the reopening meant to you and the districts you oversee?
Well, I think it's certainly been a relief. I think that it's certainly clear that people have really felt that cabin fever, built up over the last 16 months. And I know that everyone falls back in terms of describing it as getting back to normal. But I think when you go through something like that, you have to reevaluate a lot of what normal really truly represented, because there were so many aspects of how business as usual is sort of turned upside down, from corporations reevaluating work schedules and whether or not how to better integrate working from home and how that can save money and yet not diminish efficiencies. We've seen it in terms of social and racial justice or injustice that has always been there, but somehow was revealed in a very profound way. We've seen how inequities around healthcare are exposed in the sense of people of color and low income families struggling just to get the basic services before a pandemic, and how that gets magnified in the midst of a pandemic. So there are a lot of different avenues that we can look at and say that we really don't want to return. If that was normal, we don't want to return to that. We want to learn from it. We want to grow from it. We want to be able to better educate and inform and provide services that meet people's needs where they are. But no, I do think that the vaccine has been a game changer. We're now where we are because the virus has morphed into something that is a little bit more impactful, especially for those who are not vaccinated. And it has really shed an important light on those decision points that people are making. And I can only encourage those who are watching, as we've been continuing to encourage, that everyone become vaccinated. The only way that we really get back to normal, to have to discard the face mask, to be in a position where we can engage more robustly as a society, is if everyone is vaccinated, or certainly to the point of herd immunity. So we're in at least a strong enough place to be optimistic about school openings, that businesses are open, and certainly want to make sure that they stay open. So I think we're moving. We were moving in the right direction. We've hit a little bump in the road, but by all indications, what I'm hearing, and I think is bearing out, is that there's been more focus on the unvaccinated, and as a result, we're seeing more people. There's been an uptick, I should say, in those who are not vaccinated making their way to getting vaccinated. So I think that reestablishes a little bit more light at the end of the tunnel, that at least there's starting to be a shift amongst those who are sort of hard line about getting vaccinated, becoming a little bit more appreciative of the need to join the vaccinated.
At the street level, it's very easy to oversimplify the situation with regards to the pandemic. Most people will look at the situation and say, well, it's a question of not being in another lockdown. It's about wearing a mask. It's about getting vaccinated, and it's about reopening the economy. But certainly there's a lot more involved in that. What are some of the political challenges that you have faced over the last 16 months? What is it like from your perspective?
Well, 120 legislators are elected to go to Sacramento, representing the Senate 40 and the Assembly 80, and a governor and constitutional officers to do the business of policy setting for the fifth largest economy in the world. How do you keep a nation state moving in a productive way, meeting its fiduciary responsibilities, but also the day-to-day life needs of the people in this state, when so much of the economy was starting to shut down, schools were shutting down, trying to address policy that would help get schools back open, getting resources from the federal government, trying to get resources within our own budget to make sure there was PPE equipment for our hospitals at the early stages, that masks were a premium. And so with that in mind, there were certain basic things that we were still trying to learn about the pandemic, policies that we needed to set in place, working with county health officials, coordinating a strategy that was going to be effective. And quite frankly, at a lot of different turns, there was pushback. There was a lot of differencing of opinions, as so you're trying to figure out what the next course looks like and how to view it as very serious, when so many in your community were at that time still not convinced that it was as deadly a disease as was being presented. It did not help that the national leadership was sort of downplaying it. So those were the kind of challenges that we found ourselves in terms of trying to make sure that we could make the resources that needed to be available targeted to getting it to the people on the ground. the emergency providers, the healthcare providers, to make sure that they were properly outfitted to keep them safe, but also to be in a position that we were looking at addressing issues of homelessness, where the homeless population was growing during the pandemic, and emergency housing that needed to be established. People who were struggling with, then as we made our way through the pandemic, with being able to make their rent payments, losing their jobs. And so we had to sort of figure out strategies of how to address all of this, and at the same time, not inadvertently injure property owners who obviously had the need for resources from rent from their tenants, but then tenants who lost jobs, who then needed to have their issues addressed. So there were so many different elements of this, and so you're kind of thinking of it in terms of the train already pulled from the station, it's taken off, it's moving at pretty close to full speed, and you got to jump on. And there's so many different aspects of this. We're changing from day to day. Once we started to get things a little bit more under control by stay-at-home orders, which I think were necessary at the time, and it was doing what it needed to do. But then, because there was a lot of anxiousness to get back to that normal, we got out there a little bit too soon, and we started to see spikes. So it was just so much of that was going on. We couldn't deal with some of the other policy issues that we wanted to, because our focus had to be pretty much exclusively on dealing with the pandemic and trying to address that crisis. So it was a real tough time. But I will say, even during that early stage, when we started to see cars off the road, the sky was bluer, the air was fresher. So, there was that. But yeah, I think generally speaking, it was one of the more challenging times that I certainly have experienced, being in the public sector and addressing public policy under that kind of duress and under that kind of crisis.
Yeah, in light of all those challenges that you just went through, and there are quite a few of them, I'm sure there are probably even more. You simply can't cover them all. Right. Obviously, the ultimate goal was always to get things back to normal. So how disheartening is it for you and your colleagues to see us apparently sliding backward again, especially based on the knowledge that it appears that this backward slide is being driven largely by the unvaccinated?
It's I want to say it's a head scratcher, but it's more than that. It's a head banger. There's just this element of common sense. My mom and dad always taught us, you can have all of the education in the world, PhDs by your name, but if you don't have common sense, then you're in trouble. And as you see, that it's a basic survival understanding that helps you be discerning and making good decisions around your life. And when it comes to community, whether it's a family as a community, or your neighbors in your neighborhood, or your city, or your state, or your nation, we are all one people. And so we have to do sometimes that which is not only what we think in our best interest, whatever that might be, but we also have to think what the effects of that will be on our neighbors, on our family. People are deciding not to get shots, get the vaccine, and still going around the senior members of their community, of their family. And that only exposes them, because we also seen that there's potential breakthrough where those who are vaccinated are still catching the virus, and not to the extent, the impact is not to the extent that it would have been without the vaccine, but they're still getting sick. And that's totally irresponsible. Now, it's about governing yourself and making good decisions, not only about yourself, but thinking about your neighbor and your family member. And I think that as time is, so it's very disheartening, to answer your question. It's very frustrating, because a lot of time, effort, and energy has gone into trying to get back to what we'd like to say is at least more normal interaction amongst people in society. But we're fortunate. I remember when this time last year, they were talking about a vaccine, and they said, well, maybe it'll take 3, 5, or 10 years. I talk about polio and how long it took, 20 years to get a vaccine for that. Just imagine where we would be right now if there was no vaccine. You know, and so for those who are acting what I'll call irresponsible in terms of the greater good of a community, they're sort of not understanding just where we would be if there was not a vaccine, and the hundreds of millions of people who are vaccinated were not. We would be in a very, very, very bad place right now. So we're blessed in the sense that science has worked, the testing models, technology working to our advantage, and we see a host of vaccines that have made their way to the marketplace, maybe without the fullness of FDA approvals, but with the emergency order, it was necessary. And it was about life and death, and that's what it came down to. And so we are fortunate, but it is frustrating that there's still those out there who are being a little bit cavalier about their responsibility and being a part of a healthy community.
What would you say to those who use the argument that they are holding off on becoming vaccinated because of a distrust of the federal government and possibly of the medical community?
Well, their concerns and distrusts are well founded. There's history will record that the system, government, has not always dealt straightly with certain segments of our population. And they've used them in many instances. We weren't honest, they weren't transparent, and in many cases, they disrupted their civil rights. And so that's all real. Yeah, that has to be, and that is appreciated in terms of how some people are looking at that. And there may be those who have true health issues that would preclude them from, medical issues that would preclude them from taking this vaccine. And that's understandable too. But even if you fall in the former category and you have these historic, maybe even racist or biased treatment against a particular group of folks, this is not then, this is now. And what we're dealing with is trying to survive, trying to find ways where we can fight back against a virus that had reached a pandemic level worldwide. So it wasn't sort of this conspiracy that could be articulated around a certain time in our history, targeting a certain group of people. And so when we look at the health inequities that exist out there, people of color are very vulnerable to a disease like this or a plague like this, because it goes right to attacking organs that could already be compromised because of a variety of health deficiencies that the individuals don't even know they have. So I think that this is one of those moments in our history where we have to say that we're all in it together. We don't forget how the system had not worked once upon a time, and even today still struggles. But we're dealing with something that's an existential threat, not unlike climate change in a little bit different way. But these are the things that are threatening survival on the planet.
You've introduced some legislation that's really aimed at, I guess, helping the kids in school. I was wondering if you could take a moment to tell us a little bit more about AB 285, I believe it is.
So coming out of last year into this year, and certainly at the beginning of this year, we're trying to pin down how schools were going to be reopening. And one of the key parts to it in terms of my thinking, in addition to making sure everyone is safe, but also making sure that we had the right kind of personnel and training that was available at the school level, that our young people were going to be able to follow mandates and directions and to have a professional providing that leadership within the state So a school health nurse program was what we were looking to establish our position. The bill that we were articulating in AB 285 was designed to create a position. It's called a school nurse consultant, who would essentially be the health czar for schools and for making sure that policies and procedures and strategies were articulated, not only to help address getting back to school and getting kids in a safe environment and making sure that they had proper guidance on that level, but also looking at ongoing health needs, young people who needed to have access to EpiPens or other types of medical support while at school, ensuring that there were educational information to help create awareness around certain types of health needs that were important to start to embrace. So the reason that the bill is no longer active as a bill is because the governor essentially, along with the state superintendent of education, Superintendent Thurmond, found a way to identify the resources for this position and went ahead and established it in the budget. So without having to have a bill to establish this position, the governor, and it's always nice when the governor takes your bill idea and then turns it into a budget priority. So that's essentially how this bill has already sort of made its way into the fabric of the budget for the state, and positions are being filled as we speak. And as we get further into the school year, everything should be established in that position so that we start seeing the leadership that was envisioned within 285.
How disheartening was it for you to have to work under an administration that seemed so intent on downplaying the severity of this pandemic?
Well, when you say administration, you're talking about at the federal level?
Yes.
Yeah. It was incredibly a depressing moment, because public service is about serving the public's best interests and needs. And I know that our country is divided in terms of certain points of views, but when you live in a democracy, that means that there's still a good for the people approach that has to be sort of the guiding light in terms of how you provide your leadership. We don't have a king or a queen. We have a process of electing our representatives. And so when you're elected, you have to rise to a higher level of leadership, which means that you can't worry about who did not vote for you. You have to focus on the greater good for all of the people, and whether those are your supporters or not, it's about all of the people. And I don't think that was the case with the previous president. I think that his focus was more on himself and his injuries to why certain people didn't support him, and why California was, viewed as public enemy number one. But those are the times where we're not going to always agree with whoever the president is, or the governor, or whoever or even in my district, I don't have everyone agree with everything I do, but I still try to make myself present, even for those who maybe don't agree with me, because I think there's always, lessons I can learn from everyone in terms of making me a better public servant. And in this particular instance, as the previous administration was not taking the pandemic seriously early enough, it created fertile ground for it to basically take off. And there's still deniers amongst governors around the state, around the country, that believe masks are an infringement on their civil liberties. Well, they're designed to keep the virus from spreading. And that's the enemy. We have a common enemy. It's called COVID-19. So whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, or whatever you are, that's our enemy. Hillary Clinton is not your enemy. Joe Biden is not your enemy. Donald Trump is not your enemy. Our enemy is a virus that's trying to attack Democrats, Republicans, all people, wherever they live in this country. And those who are ignoring it are the red states. And what are those red states becoming redder because of the virus growing at a disproportionate rate amongst now its unvaccinated? So truth to power, it's about recognizing the need to step up and provide the kind of leadership. Abraham Lincoln, he didn't have everybody supporting him, but he had to step up for the nation. And I think that's what we need now. And we're hopefully getting it I believe we're getting it under the current administration, but the previous administration did not move as quickly, I think, as it could have to position us a little bit better.
I'm always struck by the argument that any type of requirement to wear a face mask is somehow an infringement on civil liberties. When I look at that, I think to myself, there's a clear distinction between a face mask for filtering the air and a muzzle to stop you from speaking.
Right.
And
right.
So, just a side thought. So far, we have spoken a lot about COVID, but obviously your political career entails a great deal more than just that. Unfortunately, COVID has sort of overshadowed just about everything in the last 16 or 18 months. But I'd like to turn the discussion just a little bit, and actually it still ties in with COVID in that I'd like to speak about a lot of your work on social justice reform. And certainly we've seen a lot of social injustice be brought to light over the last 16 to 18 months also. So yes, perhaps you could tell our viewers at home a little bit about all of the wonderful things, all of your hard fought efforts in that department.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, as I said last year in 2020, we saw different elements of what was going on in our society that had been going on for forever. That revealed in a more profound way a need to sort of make a stand and make a change. And as it related to social justice, we had a couple of bills that were not COVID precise, but they were COVID response as it relates to what it revealed in our society. So our first bill that we moved forward last year was AB 979, which was addressing the need for diversity on corporate boards. That bill was signed into law. It was really focused on the fact that corporate America is such an important catalyst for change if activated to do so. There is so much power in the corporate world that makes decisions on products and services that Americans live by, and decisions that they follow based on advertising. And when you're not seeing the kinds of diversity in the decision-making, the highest level of decision-making within these boards reflect the diversity of this country. And in California, it's a over 65% majority minority state. So the companies that are headquartered in California needed to start reflecting that, and that's what that bill is designed to do. And so it's out there, and we're seeing, quite frankly, really positive response as it relates to that. I think that even as it relates to the Golden Globes, the foreign press is now under pressure to start diversifying its board and more diversity in terms of how it engages in the way that it does. So we are seeing change, and I think that bill has really sparked that. The other is obviously as it related to transparency and accountability in policing. We started the conversation around duty to intervene because of what we saw inflicted upon George Floyd by Officer Chauvin. And his crime has been identified, and he is now paying the price for what he did. But what comes out of that is the reflection of what about the other officers who watched him do what he did and did not intervene. You had people on the street who were saying, "Stop him! Look what he's done. He said he can't breathe." And the officers just watched. Now, there is in California, like in Minnesota, there is a law already on the books that requires duty to intervene by an officer who's watching another officer use excessive force against a member of the public. But there still is nothing, there was nothing that was in statute that said, but here's what you must do, here's how you must intervene. And if you do not do these prescribed actions, take efforts to de-escalate, as an example, to use your video recorder, video on the vest, to record what you're saying, to reach out to commanding officer and letting them know what is going on, to report it. These are the types of things that officers are trained on, but they're not trained in specifically what it means to intervene in a situation like we saw. And then there's also the penalty in the event that you do not intervene. We have a bill this year, AB 26, that's looking to capture all of the important elements of what is required and how how officers are going to be trained going forward. And currently now, there was money in the budget in 2019 that gave post police officers standard training, the organization that basically trains police officers, resources to provide visualization and actual engagement and interaction techniques so that they would be able to actually see what it requires to do some of the stated goals of intervention. And then the other is also, as I said, we put into this bill that there would be no retaliation against an officer who decided to intervene and to report an officer who was using excessive force. And so that we believe that obviously that's something that needed to happen. And actually that was a proposal that came from law enforcement to make sure it was in the bill. We also are making sure that there is a discipline process. There's another bill that's looking at decertification, which this would be classified as a decertified offense in the event that an officer did not intervene, was proven not to intervene, and lost their job. As a result of that, they would be disqualified from serving anywhere in the state of California on any other police department if they were then disqualified for that reason. That's a separate bill. Our bill had that in it, but we pulled it out because we needed to only have it reflected in one bill, and that's SB 2. And so we think that the combination of these bills will create greater transparency and accountability, because it's all about trust. Wherever you see police officers, because there's a lot of great majority, and everyone says, and I will be another in the chorus saying that there are disproportionately those who serve as police officers. They're in it for the right reason, and they're doing the right thing. And they're trying to be good officers and they're public servants as they do their job. But there are others who have morphed into a them versus us mentality, and that has created a poison as it relates to certain communities, believing that they really are trying to protect and serve. And as a result of that, this pandemic revealed over and over and over again, one incident after another, not just George Floyd. Weeks after, there was another man who was shot in Atlanta for falling asleep in his car at a drive-in fast food restaurant. Another tasered as he woke up, and they were trying to deal with him in that situation, and he got nervous and he ran, and they tasered him and eventually shot him. So there are instances before and after that, I think, of creating greater notoriety. And at the end of the day, you really need all of the folks in law enforcement to have the trust of the people that they are and the communities that they are serving. And we believe this bill puts us on the path to hopefully creating a change in the dynamic of how police officers in those high charged moments can make sure that they are doing the right things, are trained to do the right thing, to make sure they de-escalate situations so they don't blow up as these high-profile incidents have shown.
There are many facets to the work you're doing with social justice reform. I'd also like to take a moment to talk about the Upward Mobility Act that you have.
Yeah, AB 105 was basically created as we were responding to the issue of 979, as I described, in terms of ensuring that there is greater diversity amongst our public sector or private sector companies under 979. We started to look inward and say, okay, in terms of commission appointments, what does the state look like, and how can we do make sure that we are providing the kind of leadership in terms of where the opportunities for creating upward mobility and creating opportunities for appointments to boards and commissions. Does that reflect are we reflecting the diversity of California? And so it was really taking sort of the foundational or fundamental parts of 979 and applying it to where you have the governor or speaker or pro tem or a host of other constitutional officers who have the ability to appoint to various boards. And these would be for voluntary boards, because we have 209 that's on the books that would make it, in terms of using quotas or using sex, race, or national origin, or other, or LGBT status as the guider, that we would be crossing over the line. So we wanted to make sure that it was on the positions that were voluntary, where you served without compensation. You may get a per diem, but those are the technical pieces of how to make this bill work. But the goal was also further beyond just the boards and commissions, but looking at those civil service employees who were not really being considered for upward mobility within their various positions. It came to light here recently last year with the Sacramento Bee reporting on African Americans who worked for CAR, California Air Resources Board, who had applied, who had worked there for many years, who were applying for promotional opportunities and were not even considered. So we're changing the way that the interviewing process works. We're creating balance on the panel. We're having videotapes of the panel. We're making sure that people are getting a fair shot, that when a person is stepping down and acting positions are created, those acting people will be neutral, that they won't be someone who is just sort of following the direction of the outgoing person and who they want as their favorite person to get the job, because that doesn't create equity and fairness. We're looking at different standards of how to redefine qualifications so that your experience could be taken in a more broader sense and not so narrowly defined, that in other words, you had to have been an electrical engineer working for with a master's degree or a doctorate degree to be able to and have a specific role, who maybe worked for the state once upon a time. And then if you're not at that level of educational requirement, even though it exceeds what's necessary, and you didn't work for the state before in a certain department, then you're out. So we're trying to do away with those types of techniques that kind of wash away talent and keep others from promoting upwards. So this bill creates a series of directives, and it follows a Cal HR report that basically highlights how the majority of people of color are in positions in the state that pay less than $40,000 a year. And for those jobs that are in excess, we're talking like 60% of the workforce in the state at 40,000 or less are people of color. For those in 100,000 or more, it's the flip. 60% or more are people who are not of color are in those positions. And so those are the kind of inequities that I think this bill is designed to get around. It's a very technical and complicated. We've got just about every department under the governor working with us on this, because this is I think they see this as a real opportunity to fix a system that's in need of fixing. And we're getting a lot of good buy-in from the administration and the various departments to make sure that we're putting in the language that is necessary to make sure that it works effectively within a bureaucracy, and yet creates the opportunity for all people to be able to promote to higher levels.
Well, to borrow a phrase you just uttered, which is systems in need of fixing, housing is also become a really, really big issue of recent. It's certainly been a problem for a number of years. I think that problem has really come into its own light, especially over the last 18 months. So I was hoping to take a couple of minutes to also talk about at least a couple of the bills that you have in that arena, such as AB 512 and AB 1297.
Well, yeah, no, thank you for that. The uh, the the bill that 512 is really looking at surplus land that Caltrans now owns. That is the northern stub of the 710, what was going to be a 710 freeway tunnel or surface. That was essentially, we took that out with legislation that I put forward a couple of years ago to basically change the statute that says that there will be no more freeway. Now, I think we had everyone buying into that and understanding that. When I say everyone, Caltrans, Metro, LA Metro, and others recognized that that was not the alternative that was going to carry the day. So now what do we do with the excess land that's vacant? There are still properties that Caltrans owns that are tenant occupied that are we're still trying to work through, that are not a part of this bill, because I think they'll be able to be addressed in other ways. But on the vacant land, we're encouraging that affordable housing be a primary driver for what is then the ultimate reuse of the property. We're trying to work collaboratively with the city of Pasadena to better understand beyond the use of some of that land that has to be continue to be used for transportation purposes. Obviously, St. John's and Pasadena Avenue will continue to be thoroughfares in the community, and there may be some other improvements in that general area that need to maintain transportation accessibility and promoting transportation projects. But there's a significant amount of land called the ditch that can be reprogrammed for other kinds of uses. So we're trying to find a way to give the broadest opportunities for the city to use that land at the least amount of cost, if not free. The challenge is that Caltrans, the state, has clear directives that say that if it's not for transportation purposes, that land cannot be given for free. It has to be given at a fair market value. Well, we don't want that to be the case when the goals of the state are to try to address issues of housing. And there's not any other land that I can think of that Caltrans has that's available for the ability to make a significant amount of affordable housing available. And that doesn't mean completely or solely any one level of low or very low, but also we're looking at the need for workforce housing, creating opportunities for not just rental, but home ownership. I mean, that land was taken from families that were of Japanese heritage and African American heritage, and the only vestige of African Americans in that ever being in that area of Old Pasadena is Friendship Baptist Church. But once upon a time, those were thriving African American communities and Asian American communities. And so there has to be some recognition of what that represents. But at the same time, open space, transit-related projects like transit-oriented development around the Gold Line, those are the kinds of things that we're trying to extend the definition that would allow the city to have access to the property at low or no cost. So housing is very much a part of it, and that bill is designed to create greater opportunity for the city to meet its needs on affordability of housing as well, because we can see that the city has lost and the school districts have lost the diversity because a lot of those families who could not continue to afford to live in the city have moved out of the city. So it is definitely a priority and a driver. So I think it's really important that you've also mentioned AB 1297, and that bill is designed to build on sort of the goals of the iBank and create funding opportunities for housing. It wasn't originally designed to be used for monies to go back into affordable housing. It was just basic infrastructure. We had a bill passed several years ago that authored that said that the iBank would be able to use infrastructure projects that had related purpose for housing. So in other words, putting in the sewer lines, putting in the street lights, things of that nature that would complement housing. This bill goes a step further that says that more monies from iBank can be used for projects that would be housing related, but tied to a larger project that may be the main job creating purpose of the iBank funds. So this will allow for actual units to be built. Take an example, Pasadena City College is looking for more housing for students. Then this may be an opportunity to use iBank funds for that purpose to build other projects that have ancillary housing benefit. So these are our ways of trying to get our arms around it. I mean, I think that there's still that major issue about redevelopment and the dissolution of redevelopment agencies that we're still, I think, tripping over that had the most profound impact on addressing affordability in housing and cities having resources to do those type of projects. And even then, not all of them did it, but Pasadena did. And so we want to try to figure out a way to maybe come back and get our arms around that as a potential solution. But these two bills, I think, are very important. So we're doing our part where we can.
Bringing COVID back into the fold for just a moment, how concerned are you at the expiration of the eviction moratoriums that we're now seeing beginning to take place?
Well, on the federal level, it's obviously very concerning. But as it relates to the state, we already extended the moratorium with action that was taken earlier this year, where we basically extended to June. And then, of course, in this budget, additional dollars were made available to make sure that it would continue. So in terms of families that were underwater because their rents hadn't been paid and the number for some extended period of time, and landlords were still kind of in a place where they were vulnerable. The budget, the California budget, addressed their concerns, so it extended the moratorium, and it made sure it was a formula that took care of the property owners as well. The federal level is just they're putting their head in the sand, and they're not stepping up to the plate and doing what's required under these circumstances. These are dire times, and families and people, they have one foot on a banana peel and the other one on ice. And these are dire times. And I think that what we tried to do here in California was recognize that we needed to do more. But let me just say too, as it relates to the resources that we ultimately had available to help address so many of the issues that we talked about this morning, is that even in a pandemic, the state revenue exceeded expectations to the point where we had multiple billions of dollars that were available that came into the state that allowed us to address not only our increasing in funding for public education, but also putting the resources in supporting businesses and supporting families and supporting those who find themselves in jeopardy because of not only their rent needs that needed to be met, which we've done, but also the utility bills. We just passed in this budget resources that will help address utility bills that were deferred in terms of the payments, so that families were not caught under the heavy weight of outstanding utility bills. So the federal government needs, I think, to step up and certainly address it as we've tried to do, because the need is real and people are suffering.
You've also done a lot of work in the arena of education, and though we're quickly coming to the end of the program, I was hoping you might also talk a little about AB 102.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think in terms of education, we have always tried to be as aggressive as we can to try to be proactive around student needs and addressing needs of those who are falling in the achievement gap. We had initial bill 288 that addressed the issues around dual enrollment and creating opportunities for high school students to take college level courses, but not just for the purposes of going on to a higher education, but also for vocational training, to be in a position where they can be job ready. But clearly the focus of the goal of dual enrollment is to position kids to extend their college experience. By the time they finish high school, having the potential of an AA degree allows them to go to a 4-year college and jump right in at their major level and spend only 2 years at a major college as opposed to 4 or more. And so we see it as a way of expanding opportunity. The dual pathway is also to look at vocational opportunities as well, but it makes the college experience more affordable. And it also creates opportunities for young people who family members had never been to college to demystify what college means, and to let them know they can do the work and they can do it while in high school. And that once their confidence is at a level where they can see that, it also creates, I think, a greater motivator for them to stretch and do more. So the program has been incredibly successful. We're looking to make it a permanent type of thing by eliminating the sunset clauses. And, within the lane of, as we are getting kind of towards the end, I want to just say, as we were able to have some really important budget wins this year too, we were able to get $4 million into the budget for our Pasadena Public Library. And we were able to get $250,000 for the Altadena Library to help with their mobile book program, among other things. That I think their goal was $25,000. I said, let's just put another zero behind it and try to get $250,000. So we were successful there. So as the value of education certainly is directly linked to good public libraries, and we value them. Matter of fact, if I could, I just want to show you what we're going to pass out to the city of Pasadena and also to Altadena. It's the check will be a little smaller than this, but this is for Pasadena, $4 million that's going to go to helping them with their seismic restructuring, which they just found out about here recently. And this is the $250,000 to the Altadena Library. So, we really are excited about what that represents. I know we didn't get a chance to talk about transportation, but we have a $540 million ask in front of the governor right now, part of the negotiations to complete the Gold Line project to Montclair. We were also able to get into the budget $1 million that's designed to study the feasibility, and that's going to be for Metro, to study the feasibility of extending the Gold Line from Pasadena to the Burbank Airport. 1.6 million we got in the budget for the Pasadena Playhouse to complete their HVAC project. And a lot of people didn't know, especially within the state of California, that the Pasadena Playhouse is the state's official community theater. So I told them that you have an obligation because, it's not just for the locals to raise the money, it's a state theater. And so you need to put money in there as well. And then we've got billions in the budget to help pay, as I said before, for the electric and gas utility payments and the arrears that people have had to deal with, and funding for the state to hire the school nurse program is another big one. And then we were also able to get $2 billion over the next 5 years to increase wages and increase for services for individuals who are providing services to those with developmental disabilities. And we've been working on that for a long time in a lot of different iterations. And it's always 25 million here in 20, which because of the increase in minimum wage, a lot of these folks weren't able to keep their doors open if they had to then pay that and then continue to provide the services that are fixed service dollars. And the people who are doing these jobs are not getting nearly paid what they are entitled to, because their educational experience is there and their heart commitment to serve this community is second to none. And so we're glad that when the rate study came out and identified what that number, that 1.9 billion was necessary to get them up to the level that they needed to be at. So would not be an issue of year to year continuing to nickel and dime this community. And so we're very proud of the fact that, and when I say you're asking me about my accomplishments, the things that I invested my time in, but I'm by no means the only person who has broke a lot of sweat around projects like efforts like this. Whether developmental disability, Jim Frazier up in Northern California has been a champion. Gold line funding, I know Freddie Rodriguez has been a real champion out in Pomona to make sure that we're seeing the resources make its way to Claremont and to Montclair, which this $540 million will get us there, and in time for the 2028 Olympics, which I think is a big deal. So I don't know how much time we have left, but I just wanted to make sure we got those kind of things in there. So it's not just on writing the bills, but it's also budget. But even beyond that, it's also being out, rolling up your sleeves and working with health providers and hospitals to make sure that they have what they need to be prepared last year to deal with the flow of patients that made their way into the hospitals and address them properly and be safe in doing it, or calls that we make and constituents who've been calling the office with EDD complaints and issues of not getting their unemployment checks, and the fights that we've had to deal with last year and this on that has just been beyond the pale. But we are starting to see a break in the ice on that, and people are starting to be able to see a greater response and accountability starts to happen. And so we're able to make the system work in a lot of different ways. And so I learned a lot of what I learned from my dad, who was on the LA City Council and Estate Senator Nate Holden, but I also I'm just wired. I love public service. I love being able to hear a problem and try to make it work. But I can't do even all of what I want to do if I didn't have great staff. I've got a great team that works in our district office. A lot of times they're putting out the fires before I even know there's a fire, no pun intended. Well, and I just want to, and in my capital staff too. So I'm very blessed in having great people around me that work in this office and help make a difference. And this is just an example of some of the things that we've been able to do.
Assemblyman Holden, with that, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but I really would like to thank you for all of your public service, everything that you do, and certainly for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with me this evening. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to all the great things that you're doing. For our viewers at home, if there are topics you would like to see addressed in our program, you can email them to us at arroyolive@pasadenamedia.org, and we may include them in a future broadcast. Until next time, this has been Arroyo Live. I'm Joe Carbonetta. Thank you for watching, and good night.